and welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and other literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick, the host of the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce our very first guest, author Julia Dahl. Julia is the author of 4 novels, including Conviction, Run You Down, and Invisible City, which was a finalist for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel, one of the Boston Globe's best books of 2014, and has been translated into 8 languages. Her latest book, The Missing Hours, was just released and is receiving rave reviews. A former reporter for the New York Post and CBS News, Julia now teaches journalism at NYU. So, let's get started. Julia, thank you so much for joining me on the inaugural episode of Literary Prospects. I'm really excited to have you here. And your new book is amazing. It's amazing. I read it in almost one sitting. I do have a kid, a 6-year-old, so it's difficult to read anything in one sitting, but I think it took 2. So that's saying something. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So we'll jump in, and actually you and I were sort of just discussing earlier the difference these days in promotion of your book and the new book tour. So I was interested to hear a little bit more about how your experience has been with this book in the time of COVID.
Yeah, right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm honored and excited. Yeah, previously, so book tour now, at least for most of us, is virtual events. And I actually kind of love it. I mean, partly I love it because I, like you, have a small child, and just like jetting off to random cities for not that necessarily many people to show up is not really on the list of things I want to spend my time doing. When my first book came out, I didn't have a kid, and it felt a lot different. I was like, well, sure, I'll just go wherever anybody invites me. But the secret to book tours is that most authors, like the big authors, the James Pattersons, the Gillian Flynns, the Sally Rooney's, the publishers pay for them to go all over the world, right, to on book tour. But the rest of us, the sort of mid-list authors who have contracts and sell books, but we're not selling millions of copies, we pay for our book tours. And so I would get invited to bookstores, around the country, which, again, is a success. Like, right, it's cool to be invited to a bookstore, but I had to pay to go. And my first book, I did that. I went, to bookstores all over the country. And some were great successes, and some, like, literally 3 people showed up and 2 of them were related to me. That's humbling. But most authors you talk to have that story. But now that I have an almost 6-year-old, it doesn't actually seem as fun to run all over the country going to bookstores, especially knowing that I don't think that it actually moves that many more copies than something else, like potentially a virtual event. And a virtual event, I think, is great. Well, it's great for me because I can just like run upstairs, put on my makeup, and just rearrange my office a little. But also because it means that people from all over can go. Like if I was doing a bookstore event at the Poison Pen, which is where I did an event for one of my first books, which is a fantastic mystery crime bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. If you're not in Scottsdale, Arizona, you can't come to the event. But, so I did an event through NYU last night, but my parents who live in North Carolina logged in, and I have a student who lives in China who logged in. And then I did an event for a bookstore in Chapel Hill last week, and I had friends from California who logged in. So in a way, it might even be better in terms of like getting more people involved. Also, it doesn't take that much effort. Even if you're in town, you have to put on clothes and drive there. But if you're not that you could just like log on while you're cooking dinner or something.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So maybe this is the new way.
Maybe it'll be like, I did do one live event I live up in New York's Hudson Valley, and there's a bookstore in Newburgh called the Barking Goose, and they have an outdoor seating area. So I was like, well, because I'm still pretty COVID cautious. And I said, well, if I can do it outside, let's do an event. And fortunately, it was beautiful weather until the very end when it rained. We just set up tables, and I had a table to sign, and I invited friends, and they had food and drink at the cafe. And it was awesome. So maybe you have one instead of 5 or 10.
So we touched on the fact that this is your fourth novel. It's not your first. Um, your first three books centered around a central character, which is reporter Rebecca Roberts. And I believe that you had initially planned to have Rebecca appear in the missing hours, but eventually this one became published as a standalone work. So what made you decide to leave Rebecca behind for this one?
Well, it kind of was just this it didn't work for the story. The story that I wanted to tell in The Missing Hours was sort of inspired by a case I covered when I was a reporter at CBS News out of Steubenville, Ohio, back in it was 2012 or 2013. And long story short, a teenage girl went to a house party and got really drunk and was assaulted by at least two boys. And what made it even sort of more egregious and more 21st century was that the boys took pictures and video and sort of passed them around the town. And I covered this story, and I just couldn't stop thinking about this girl and what it would have been like to, have the trauma of being assaulted, but then the compounding trauma of, having no memory of what happened, but knowing that all these people have seen pictures of you and this like totally humiliating, traumatic time.
Mhm.
And never knowing going forward if the people you meet had seen you in that moment, like how terrifying and traumatic that would be. So I couldn't stop thinking about her, and then and further about her family. Like, what would it be like if your sister that happened to your sister or your daughter or your best friend? And so I knew I wanted to write the story basically of, if you read the first chapter of The Missing Hours, it's Claudia, the main character, wakes up. She realizes she doesn't know how she got home. She's missing pieces of her clothing, and it's clear sort of how the way she feels her body that she's been assaulted, but she doesn't have any memory of it. So I knew I wanted to write a book that started with that scene and kind of, you know, how she dealt with it, but also what the ripple effects were for her family and all the people around her. And yeah, I initially thought, okay, well, maybe Rebecca Roberts, because I was contracted, I have a contract with my publisher for another Rebecca Roberts book, a fourth
Mhm.
Rebecca Roberts book. And initially I thought, okay, well, maybe that's um, Rebecca will investigate that. Maybe this girl goes missing and somehow Rebecca gets involved in investigating it. And I actually wrote a lot of that. But sort of after, as I was writing, I kind of realized, first of all, like every time I would go back to the Rebecca part, I would be kind of bored. Like I didn't want to tell another story with Rebecca in it right now. I
Mhm.
wanted to tell Claudia's story and dive more into her family and the people around her. Um, so I talked to my editor and was like, so what if and fortunately, I have an amazing editor, Kelley Raglan at Minotaur, and an amazing agent, and they were both like, "We trust you. Make it good." So I was like, "Okay." So it was really like in service of the story. The story did not need or want a kind of investigative reporter character. It needed to just be focused on the people who were personally involved. So I did that, and I'm really glad I did.
And you said that you will be bringing Rebecca back for a fourth book. I had noted that I wanted to find out if Rebecca was coming back ever.
Well, I mean, I don't have one in mind.
Mhm.
And I actually am writing another book, but it's not a Rebecca book. So I will like never say never to Rebecca because I love her and I love the idea of writing about Rebecca. The first Rebecca book came out in 2014, so we're getting on 10 years. So I love the idea of like in a few years maybe writing a book where Rebecca like has a kid or is maybe even in a different city or something, like really switching it up. But for now, I mean, when I started writing Invisible City, the book that became Invisible City, I didn't actually conceive of it as a series. I wrote it because I was really interested in writing about a reporter character. I was really interested in writing about the Hasidic community. But after almost 10 years of writing about it, I just sort of was like, okay, I'm interested in spending my time on other things. My brain, I wanted to, because when you're writing a book, you live with those people in your head as much as you live with the people you live with.
Mhm.
And I wanted to live with other people. I was like, I didn't want to be monogamous I didn't want to be married to Rebecca anymore. We needed a separation. I've never thought of it that way. But anyway, and So I have put her aside for now, but really like her, and I imagine in a couple books she will come back. I think I will definitely buy another one, but it'll probably be a while.
You've said that all of your books are really about some sort of flaw in the justice system. So I am wondering, do you usually start out with the flaw and sort of build your plot around that, or do you start with, your bigger idea of the story and then sort of work in the applicable flaws?
That's such a good question. So I don't usually start with the flaws. Like what I usually start with, it actually is a little bit different for every book. With Invisible City, it started mostly with the idea that I really wanted to learn more about the Hasidic community. And I also really wanted to write about a young reporter who was doing really morally challenging work and had like no supervision, and so was making lots of mistakes. And because when I was a reporter, that was one of the things that sort of, it was almost like a media critique when I first started Invisible City. But it was also a critique of sort of the way that this insular community and the police had this kind of like don't ask, don't tell relationship in New York City.
Mhm.
um, and that was the first book. The next book was really, if you've read Invisible City, you know that the sort of ghost character in the book is Rebecca's mother, who abandoned her when she was a small child. And as I was writing Invisible City, I thought, I really want to know what happened to the mom. Like, why did she abandon her? Where did she go? And that was sort of the crux of the next book, although it was also married with the idea that while I'd been in reporting Invisible City, because I really had to report in order to write this novel about a community that I was not a part of. Um, I met a lot of people in the Hasidic community, or who, many of whom, most of whom, frankly, who'd left, who were gay and who, basically couldn't live in that community. Um, and I was so inspired by and curious about their stories and the way that they sort of created their lives outside of the community. And that was the inspiration in a way for the second book. And then the third book, the inspiration was a little more about a kind of larger injustice, and that was the third book is Conviction, and it's about a young man, in the early 90s, a young black man who's sort of quickly convicted of murdering his family. Um, and Rebecca sort of gets a note from him 30 years later saying, like, I didn't do this, please help me. And that was inspired by just the like barrage of wrongful conviction cases that we started seeing in the mid and late 2000s, early 2010s. Starting with, one of the big cases was the Central Park Five. These young boys who'd been convicted of raping and beating a woman in 1989, and they were exonerated. And I felt like every time I opened up the paper, it was another, like, basically black man who had been convicted as a teenager, often, or a young person, of a crime, and now DNA and new witnesses or witnesses recanting showed us they didn't do it. So that was the inspiration for Conviction. And then with The Missing Hours, it was very much story. It was, I want to dive into what it is like to be this a woman who's had this happen to her, a young woman who's had this happen to her. But married with that is the problem in the justice system, which is that that it is vanishingly rare for a sexual assault, specifically, especially a sexual assault that involves alcohol, where the woman was drinking, especially if she decided to drink herself. If you drug someone and rape them, you have like a little more chance of getting convicted. But the just the fact that those cases are almost never get to trial and to a conviction. And so I wanted to sort of dive into what it's like as a woman to know that, like, this happened to you, and the character of Claudia is pretty savvy, right? She's a wealthy, privileged, educated woman in New York City, young woman in New York City. And like, as soon as this happened to her, she knows, like, nobody's going to believe me. It's not like I'm going to be able to walk into the police station and be like, those guys wronged me, put them in jail. Like, it's not going to work like that. And so I wanted to sort of explore what it is like in this time when a lot of women know that something like this could happen to them and they're not likely to get any kind of sort of quote unquote justice from the justice system. So what do you do?
And for most of the missing hours, you stick with three main points of view, which are Claudia, the victim, Edie, her sister, and Trevor, who is a friend of Claudia's who gets sort of roped into helping her out with this whole thing. But there is a brief part, I think in part 3, where you do slip into the POV of the perpetrators of this crime and the father attorney, and I won't give too much away, but I was interested in your decision to do that and how you chose to include and felt that it was important to include those points of view as
Right.
well.
Well, there's several reasons. One is that I really love reading books where you get multiple points of view, and I really love reading books where you get the bad guy's point of view, right? I feel like you learn something about a crime when you get a minute with the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, part of it was just this is the kind of book I like to read, and I always try to write a book that like I'm enjoying reading at that time. Like for this book, I really wanted it to be like short, like kind of punch you in the face, short chapters, fast paced, because that was what I wanted. And I think some of that was the pandemic, right? Like my attention span was just shot. Um, but I also really wanted this book to be not just about the effect of a sexual assault on the sort of victim whose body it's perpetrated on, but the ripple effects and the fact that a sexual assault is going to affect the perpetrators, and it's going to affect their families, and it's going to affect people even beyond them. And so I wanted to sort of acknowledge that truth in part, and that was one of the reasons that I gave them each, like basically a chapter. Um, but I also wanted one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, and I mostly do this through Trevor, but through the sort of perpetrators, I really was interested in talking a little bit about, or really more exploring and asking questions about masculinity, young men in this day and age. And I have a son who's 6, and I need to help him become a good man, right? And I have, my best friend is my husband, who I have lived with now for 15 years. So in a way, like I spend most of my time with the males of the species, and yet mostly what I've written has been women. I have a sister. My roommates before my husband were all women. I am a feminist. Like, so, but as especially I'm starting to raise a boy, I'm thinking a lot more about what is it like to be a young man. How and where do young men sort of quote unquote go wrong? And then also and very specifically around the issue of sexuality, right? Like, I remember what it was like to be a teenage girl and like starting to experiment with sex and starting to sort of come into my own sexually. But I don't really know what that was like as a young man. And if you're straight and I'm straight, I was mostly dating. I was dating men. So I had to, like, my sexuality was entwined with dudes, right? But I didn't really know what was going on with them. They were just like they were just part of the dance. But I but a few years ago I had a conversation sort of just randomly with my husband, and we were talking about this, like about, just being learning or going into life as a sexual person. And he talked about how when he was a teenager, it was confusing to him that, or that he felt sort of a little bit unsure because he felt like, well, women, the girls want you to be nice and hold their hand and give them flowers and ask them to the prom. But they also really like the bad boy, right? Like you're also supposed to be that sometimes. And he was like, it was confusing. I didn't know, what am I supposed to be? And as when you're, what do they want me to be? And then when you're a young person, you're trying to create your personality and your values. So that was confusing. And then also sort of trying to get it, I mean, you always, like, I was always trying to like get a boyfriend or and do guys are trying to like, get laid. So how do you do that and also like keep your own moral compass? And I wanted to explore that. And I for Trevor, I really explored. He was the guy in the book that I really explored that with, because he's like, he runs into Claudia, and it's clear something really bad has happened to her, and he wants to help her. Like he truly wants to help her, but he also truly wants to like get naked with her, and he can't not feel that way. Like that is just how he feels. But so he's always sort of fighting that because he knows like he can't like make a move or anything like that. That would be wrong. But he's sort of frustrated with his body that still wants that. And then the other two guys too, like they each have different experiences of masculinity and sexuality that I think, are, they don't excuse what they did in any way, but there's a, like, I'm always interested in like why people do make bad decisions, and I wanted to give at least a window into how they got to that moment where they did this awful thing.
We talked about your son a little bit, and I to have a son, which we have discussed. And so the next question that I sort of had on my list for you was, were you thinking about him when you were writing this book? And have you actually started? I mean, I know he's 6. My son is 6. He's almost 6, right?
Almost
So,
6, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you feel this responsibility to start teaching him like about consent and using these kinds of words at this age? Because I feel like
Yeah,
I'm like
yeah.
telling him when he's on the playground wrestling around, don't touch anyone's body
Unless they give consent, and that's exactly what I do. Exactly. Like so, and and this I'm learning because I didn't have brothers. Little boys love to like just tackle each other and wrestle, and they're, and so and sometimes they'll do that like to little girls who are like no, and so big thing is no means no. She says no, stop touching. If he says no, stop touching, walk away. So that's important, obviously. Yes. And then I have used and will continue to use the word consent because I think it should just be part of his vocabulary and part of how he knows to interact with the world. And exactly that. I like, we were like, we were at the park with some friends, and he has this one friend. They're very, they adore each other, and they both, I mean, they'll like literally wrestle on the lawn for 30 minutes, and it kind of looks like they're attacking each other, but then you look closer and they're smiling,
Yes.
so I'm like, all right, and so I'll say, as long as he consents to wrestling with you, that's fine. But if he starts to say no, then you have to stop. So
Mhm.
yes, absolutely. I think the word consent, like, it's just, and it's a simple thing. It's not necessarily about sex. It's like, if you are going to touch someone, they need to have given you permission,
Right.
or you need to ask permission. That is a normal and should be a normal thing. So yes, very much so. Because, right, like, from a woman's point of view, that's something, I mean, if I had a little girl, I would probably have to be teaching her when she's a little older to do things like be careful, about getting drunk in public places. Make sure your friends are with you. Walking home alone. That stuff that sucks that we have to be taught. But I mean, I was taught to like walk home with my keys in my hand
Yeah.
in case somebody came behind me and I could like poke them. I was taught
Yeah.
that at 10 probably. Um, and it sort of sucks, but I would still be doing it for my daughter because my goal would be to keep her safe. And with my son, my goal is also to keep him safe. But it's like a different kind of safe, right? Like safe, and he I know that he's already like a sort of strong kid, right? And so I know that like the thing that he needs to be safe from is not necessarily like other people hurting him, but how he interacts with other people, and so that he isn't perceived as somebody who's aggressive or somebody who's overstepping the bounds, right? Oh, it's complicated.
This is the first book that you have written since becoming a
Since
mom.
I became a mom, yeah.
Yeah. Do you find that it's different? Is the experience of creating the work different? Do you think your work is different, or is it just
Yes, the
how on?
experience was definitely different. It was so much harder, at least at the beginning, because like when you're, I had sort of three pieces of my brain always. It was, I had my day job, which was, I was a reporter. I
Mhm.
had my creative work, which was writing novels, and then I had the rest third of my life that was like, keeping my relationships intact, keeping my mental health intact, right?
Mhm.
The life stuff. And then all of a sudden in comes a child, and those things have to, like, there's only so much of the whole, so all of that gets like broken up and has to get rearranged, and it took me years to figure out, frankly, how to find time. And the easiest thing to kind of boot is the creative work, because even though I was under contract for a book, and I blew past that contract by 2 years, this book was supposed to be out 2 years ago. um it was the one thing in my life that, because I had an editor who was also a mom and was like, look, you got to figure out how to do your life before that's the more important thing. And thank goodness she was like that. So it was the one thing that was easy to be like, I don't have time to write right now. And really, but the thing that I really didn't have time to do, or space in my brain to do, was think about the book. And that, I spend at least twice the amount of time walking around, sitting around, driving around, thinking about the book and who's going to happen, who's going to do what and where and why and what their relationships are, as I do sitting and writing. And in order to do that, you have to have space in your brain that's free, that's not thinking about the baby, or not thinking about work, or not thinking about, we moved 2 years ago, not thinking about, are we going to live, where are we going to live? And I just didn't have that space for a long time. And it was really frustrating, and it made me really depressed and angry, and I felt like I'll never write again. And it was hard. It was hard, but I was really committed to this book. I was really committed. And I think that if I hadn't been so committed to this story and to the idea that this was going to be a book that was going to be different and was going to be a book I would have wanted to read, book that I wanted out there, that like I felt like wasn't out there yet, I probably would have just given up, because it was really hard. But now, 6 years in, now, for the first time, my son is like, he went to school 2 hours ago, and he will not be home for 5 hours. And that is an amazing resource of time that I just didn't have for almost 6 years, because of the pandemic. And he, whatever, we just didn't, I was, I made that choice too. I mean, didn't have a full-time job, but the last 3 years I've been teaching at NYU and doing manuscript editing. But I made the choice to spend more time, at home with my son, because I had the privilege to do that. My husband could make some money, and I could make enough money doing what I needed. So I'm happy I made that choice. But it also just sort of slowed everything, creatively and professionally down. But now I'm back.
Yay!
But it does. It really, I mean, for me at least, and I have never been a person who can write like in the middle of the night. I need 8 hours of sleep. I need a block of a few hours to write. I'm not the person that can scribble like while I'm breastfeeding. There are people like that, and God bless them. They're like miracles. I don't know how they do it. I'm envious. Well, also I have, the privilege of, frankly, having the ability to, I have another job, and I have a partner who helps, pay the mortgage. But right, like not everybody has that, and I have that, and I'm really blessed to have that. But now, it took 4 years to write The Missing Hours, which is a lot longer than it took to write any of my other books. And I really hope, I've just started a new book, and I'm, my goal is like 18 months. I feel like that is reasonable. We'll see. 18 months to finish it, not to publish it. I mean, I figure like, hopefully it's you're in the end of 2021. I hope it comes out like early 2024, maybe. So 2 years, a little over 2 years. I don't know. We'll see.
That's impressive. Well, I was wondering, and I was wondering about The Missing Hours, your latest one, and how long it took you to write it. So I'm interested to hear that it was a long time, because the New York Times has called it, let's see, an adventure thriller and a great reckoning with the moment we find ourselves in. So congrats on all the great reviews.
Oh right. Yeah, that's I'll live on that for 30 years.
And it feels very of the moment. And as I was reading it, I thought, and seeing all of these reviews, I thought, did she just hit this at the right time? Has she been working on this? Has it been simmering for a long time, and it just so happened to sort of the publication coincide with this moment where we're seeming to have this reckoning with consent and rape culture and power dynamics? All of these things have always, we know, been big problems, but they seem to be really at the forefront lately. So I was interested to know, like, oh, but did she just whip this out in 6 months?
Right. Well, I worried about that because I actually started the book like before Me Too. I mean, I'm not long before Me Too, but like, see, that was 26. That was like this time of the year in 2016, right around the election.
Mhm.
And I remember when Me Too happened, I probably had 50 pages or something like that. And I was like, shoot, like, is this book not going to be relevant anymore? Which is like a joke, right? Um, but I mean, yeah, that's the sad thing is like it's just as relevant, maybe even more so as it was 5 years ago. I mean, and honestly, I think it's going to be relevant for a long time. Like, until we figure out, I mean, sexual assault is never going to go away. Crime is never going to go away, right? You hope that you make a dent in the numbers, and we have, right? I mean, like the it is safer to live in the United States for, I guess, not for everybody. That's really actually the huge caveat. But at the very least, like the crime rate has gone down significantly overall since even the 90s, right? But I think that, like, the only way we make a dent in rape culture is men, right? I mean, that's not actually true because women are part of rape culture, right? Like, there's so much. That's not true. Let's forget that I said that. Um, so much of this was actually something that I heard Megan Abbott talk about. Her new book, The Turnout, is at some level it's about like two sisters, and a sort of man comes, and things blow up. And one of the things she talked about, as being inspiring or being an inspiration for the book, was this podcast called Dirty John. Did you listen to Dirty John? Or there was also a TV show.
Yes, I remember. See, I've meant to listen and watch, but I haven't.
Yeah, so I listened to the podcast, but I didn't watch
Okay.
the show. And basically, it's like, long story short, it's about a guy, like a kind of Casanova guy who cons a whole bunch of women. And the thing that she found interesting and took as like sort of a germ for her next book was the way the women involved like turned on each other and were just awful to each other about like, how could you fall for this guy, or what. And that's part of rape culture, right? Is the way women look at each other and say, well, if she hadn't gotten so drunk, or what did she expect at the bar by herself, or something like that, right? Like, that's the same attitude that gets us to the idea that like a jury's not going to convict a guy if you brought him home, of your own volition, and then he raped you, right? um so and I think that, I wanted to really talk about that in this book. I wanted to like force people to recognize that you don't have to be a saint to deserve not to be victimized or to deserve justice, right? Like, Claudia is not, and that was one of the things that I really wanted to do with this book, is Claudia is not an easily likable person at all. Like, she is rich and white and privileged, and she's kind of a snob, and she's frankly kind of like clueless about the way, anybody who isn't in her fabulous upper, Manhattan life lives.
Mm.
Um, and she's one of those girls on Instagram who posts like bikini pictures and stuff like that, right? But that doesn't mean that she deserves to get raped, right? And I wanted to challenge readers to sort of be like, I don't really like, there's a lot I don't like about her, but she still deserves justice, and she still deserves to be safe in her body. um you, those are questions I feel like maybe we're getting better at addressing, that like, you don't have to be perfect to get justice or to be safe.
All right. Hold on once. Let me make sure. Oh, nope, I'm not muted. Okay, great. We're sort of coming towards the end of our time. So before I let you go, I would really like to do a sort of quick fire round of some like general writing and craft questions, if you're up for it. So
Sure.
the first one, which I'm sure you probably get all the time, but I like to ask everyone, is how did you get started? How did you get started writing? Yeah.
uh, so I started writing fiction and nonfiction at the same time. I was a senior in high school. My mom was like, you're good at writing, you should join the paper. So I joined the paper, and it was really fun. And right about the same time, I met a really cool girl. I grew up in Fresno, California, named Katie Kuzmar, who had really cool hair and really cool outfits. And she always had a notebook with her and a pen. And she was always just like writing little poems or little observations. And I thought, that's cool. So I bought a notebook and a pen. And like, I've never been without that notebook and pen. So I just sort of, I loved playing with words. I loved, it was a great marriage, writing, of my love for words and writing. I'd always read, you know, constantly had a book in hand. My mom's motto my whole life was bring a book wherever you go, bring a book. And but I also am a really nosy person. I really want to know what's going on in people's lives and, try to climb inside their heads. And writing was like the perfect marriage of that, right? I could kind of imagine my way into people's lives. But, and then I went to college and we didn't have a journalism or really a creative writing major. So I just like did it on, I worked for the school paper. I took a couple creative writing classes and enjoyed them. And then I knew I wanted to be a novelist. Like that was the dream, right? But I knew that, like, first of all, I didn't have a novel when I graduated high school. And I was like, I don't think you can just like make a living. Even I knew even then that making a living as a novelist is like very hard. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna work in media. So I got jobs in magazines and women's magazines, and then at the New York Post, and finally CBS News. But throughout this, I was always writing fiction. I wrote a novel in my early 20s that's in a file somewhere on an old computer that I couldn't find an agent for. I couldn't sell it. I wrote almost a whole nother novel that I abandoned. And then, so I spent some time really focusing on journalism writing. And really, I think that I never stopped thinking about fiction, but the writing every day as a reporter, it was at the New York Post that I sort of restarted being a fiction writer, forced me to recognize a couple things that I think are really important about fiction writing that sometimes if you're just in fiction, you don't remember. One is that this story is paramount. Like, what story are you trying to tell? And it doesn't have to be a super plot driven, but it could just be how this person reacts to this event, right? Mm-hmm. But that focusing on that and focusing on and privileging the story was really important. That you have to do in journalism, right? Like, just tell me what happened. Mm-hmm. And then also the importance of economy of words, that most people are not super interested in how, beautifully you can describe the sky, or if you have to earn that big, fancy description of the sky. But what people want are nouns and verbs. Who thought what happened, why? And figuring that out made me a better fiction writer. But in terms of like the actual, like, how did I get an agent? It was luck and a little bit of who, my very first job out of college back in 1999 was I was a fact checker. I was an intern and then a fact checker at Entertainment Weekly. And one of the people who was like just a notch above me was this girl named Gillian Flynn. And I used to like make her photocopies and chat with her, and she was nice. And then 10 years later, I wrote a novel, and I had seen her books on the shelves. I mean, this was before Gone Girl, so it was before she was like the biggest writer in the world. Mm-hmm. But I saw her first book, Sharp Objects, in a Barnes and Noble, and I remembered, oh, Gillian, that's the girl from Entertainment Weekly. And I picked it up and I thought, this is the kind of book I want to write. Like, it really was an inspiration to me to be like, if she can do it, I can do it. Like, we worked together. So I wrote my book, and it was 8 or 9 years later, and I just emailed her, like, or maybe I even found her on Facebook and sent her a message, and I was like, hi, I don't know if you remember me. I was an intern. I just wrote a novel, and I wonder if you have any advice. And she messaged me back and said, oh, I gave her like the 3-sentence pitch for what my book was. And she said, your book sounds interesting. I mentioned it to my agent. Why don't you send her 50 pages? And I got my agent. So it was like, and in my previous novel, I had queried a zillion agents and they'd all rejected me. So I think the book was better, but also I just got really lucky, and Gillian Flynn is a really nice person.
How do you keep your writing organized? When
I just rolled my eyes. It's really hard. It was really hard with The Missing Hours because it's got so many voices, and because I'm trying to tell like a linear story, but the voices are people who are in different places and have different knowledge of the plot, basically. And I probably had like 6 sets of note cards that I would put out with like who's talking when and what the plot points were, and I'd move them around and then I'd throw them away and try it again. It was really hard. It's going to be a while before I write a book with that many points of view again, because it's tough to keep it organized. I had to just keep plugging away and moving pieces around, and I can't tell me, well, like this book is it's kind of a short book. It's like 65,000 words, and I have more than 70,000 words in an outtakes file of stuff I wrote that is that's not in the book. So I would write a chapter in like Edie's point of view, and then realize, no, this needs to be told from Claudia's point of view. So I'd have to rewrite the chapter from somebody else's point of view. So I don't think I'm a good person to ask about organization. I am trying with this new book, with the book I've just started writing. I'm trying to do more upfront work about, like, building the sort of scaffolding of the plot. But I find that work kind of boring. I kind of just want to like write. But I think that probably it saves me a lot of time and heartache if I do a little more upfront work. So I'm trying to be better about that.
That was actually the next question is, do you sort of start out with, the plotter or pantser?
Right.
Do you just kind of like sit down at your desk and write what you think about writing for that day? Or do you have this whole thing like built in your mind and you just choose where you're going to dive in?
For this one, and for most of the previous ones, other than The Missing Hours, because The Missing Hours is not like my other books, especially the first two, were very more traditional kind of murder mysteries. Like there's a body on the first page and you figure out who did it in the end. And The Missing Hours is very much not that. So it didn't have that built-in, like kind of trajectory. This book will be a little more like that, in that there's like basically someone dies near the beginning, and although the book is about it's about a family, it's about a town, the sort of easy trajectory of eventually I have to get to who did it, right, helps. But no, I'm not an outliner. I just like I have sat down to outline books, and I've sat down to outline this book multiple times, and I just get like bored. So I'm more of a pantser, but I'm trying to bring plotting elements into my work because I think probably it makes it easier.
Do you have a particular writing routine? Like, is there a specific time that you write every day, or what does your routine look like?
My routine is that I have like writing days, and those are the days when well, until my son went to school, those were the days when I had childcare. My husband's sister is my best friend and an amazing woman, and she watches my son, and has since he was born, 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 days a week, depending on sort of where I am in a book, if I like desperately need time. And on those days I write. And usually I start out because like I said, I feel like I need a block of time. But usually I start out like right after I finish talking to you, I'm going to go take a walk. And that helps me sort of focus my mind and think and get back into the story, as opposed to all this other stuff going on in my brain. Um, and often I'll have my phone with me, and like I'll come up with a line of dialogue or a little plot point or a relationship, something, and I'll narrate it into the phone and send myself basically an email that I then get when I get to either back home or the coffee shop or whatever, where I'm going to sit and write for a couple hours. And I usually move around. Like I now live in this, when I was in Brooklyn, I would move from coffee shop to coffee shop. And now that I live in the small town, there's one coffee shop and there's a library and there's my house. And so I'll write somewhere for an hour and a half or so, and then I'll take another kind of stretch and take another little walk, write somewhere for another hour and a half or so. And those are the best days in the world. Like they're just where I love, even when they're frustrating and I write 100 words, they really feel like days where I'm not the most myself, but like where I'm like accomplishing something, and it's just fun. I mean, writing can be really, really, really hard, but when you get the chance to just be with yourself and the characters, it's sort of magical, and it feels like it's such a privilege to be a published author. I mean, I am not the Gillian Flynn. My books sell okay, but I get to publish them. Like that's the 17-year-old me with the Notebook. If I could have seen me now in my 40s, I published my 4th book. The New York Times liked it. Like, it's it's pretty great. And and on the days when I'm really frustrated with the writing or something else, I try to remember that and just go like, you get to do this, you're writing another book and you're going to write another one after that. That's awesome.
What do you know now that you wish you had known when you were going through the process of publishing the first one?
Oh, that's a great question. You really have to take it all in hand. You can't rely, as much as like my publisher has been great. But you can't rely on like just the publicist and the marketing person. They have 10 books or X number of books that they're focused on. You're the only one who cares about your book as much as you do, I mean, this is your life for years. So, I, for the missing hours, took in hand a lot of like, I mean, I emailed everybody. I was calling bookstores, let me tell you about this book that I've got. I'll send you book plates. I was, in getting in touch with everyone I knew in media and other authors saying like, can I send you a copy of this book? Can I send you an e-galley? Can I send you a hardcover galley? Posting on social media, that kind of stuff, saying yes to every invitation, right? Like you have to do the work and you have to drive the train. And like what I did this time was I made like a long list of potential contacts of people that I thought might like the book in media, right? Just, and not people I knew, even people who I saw on Twitter who review books. And I made a like an Excel spreadsheet that I shared with the publisher and was like, let's send to these people. And I'd never done that before, but I think it helps them. They have a million things to do. So I would say definitely take the publicity in hand, literally go take a copy of your book to the local Barnes and Noble and say, hey, this is going to be coming out in a few months. I'll sign copies, take a look, all that stuff. And then the other thing is that it won't change your life. Like I have such a, I have such a vivid memory of like the week before my first book came out and I was talking with my husband about something and I was like, well, but that'll be after my book comes out. Things will be different. Nothing's really that different. Like, I have the satisfaction of having published books and accomplished a dream and I make a little bit of money from it, but it's not enough. I tell my son that if I sell 1 million copies we get a pool. Like we don't have a pool yet. It doesn't change it, but it doesn't change your day-to-day life at all. You're still living with the people you're living with, you're still doing the other work that you're doing, you're still you're still you, just and what it changes is a sort of mental, psychological and satisfaction a little bit. But I really had some idea that it would like change my life, and it didn't.
Well, what might change your life, and this will be our last question, if when one of your books is made into, we'll say The Missing Hours is made into a TV series or movie, what do you picture being the theme song?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. I wish you'd asked me further. I would have thought about it. I did have a theme song for one of my other books. What's the theme song for The Missing Hours? Well, it's going to be something angry. Oh gosh, I wish I could say. Maybe I'm thinking of like one of the songs that comes to mind is there's this great Pink song called Trouble. But it's almost a little too happy. Oh, it's a great song. It's so rockin'. It's like I'm trouble. Oh, it's a great song. And maybe I'll say that, although it's a little too up like happy. But maybe that. I'll say Pink's Trouble.
Okay, I like it. I like it. That's a good one.
Yeah, you can play that. It's a great. I actually haven't listened to it in years, but it's a great song. I'm actually, for my new book, I didn't listen to a lot of music when I was writing The Missing Hours, but I'm making a playlist for the new book I'm working on, and I kind of wish I had done that for The Missing Hours. Now, especially that you say that, yeah.
What's on your playlist for your new one?
A good little a couple of the Taylor Swift songs from Folklore. Here, wait, I'm gonna actually look at it. Wait, hold on. I'm pulling up the playlist. Where's my book? It's called Book 5 playlist. Okay, so I've got a couple Taylor Swifts. I've got some Pogues. I'm a fan of the Pogues.
Mhm.
And a little bit of there's this great singer-songwriter named Kathleen Edwards,
Mhm.
who has a song that it might be the theme song for this book. I don't know, called 6 O'Clock News. That's really a great song. A little bit of Green Day. There's actually a Green Day moment in The Missing Hours, but I'm a huge Green Day fan. Like it was big. They were really big when I was a teenager in the 90s.
Mhm.
Um, and there's also a little like there's this great song by Pete Droge called "If You Don't Love Me, I'll Kill Myself," but it's like really kind of a fun, happy song. It's such a weird song. I'm gonna do this like when the book comes out. I'm keeping this playlist and I'm totally gonna share it.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, I was gonna say,
yeah,
you share the playlist with us. Okay.
but right now I feel like the theme song, honestly, for the new book is this great song from Folklore, Taylor Swift's, and I'm not like a big Swiftie at all.
Mhm.
Um, she's never been like gotten it, but I really like that album called Betty, which is this song from the point of view of a teenage boy who basically cheats on his girlfriend, and he's desperately trying to get back with her. And the new book that I'm writing is told mostly from two points of view: a mother who's like in her 40s and a son who's in his 20s. And um and so I'm doing that male point of view again, which I'm really excited about. Again, like I feel like I'm not sure if I would do that so much if I wasn't the mom of a son, and my best friend was my husband. But I'm really excited to write a guy again.
Did you start the new one as soon as you finished your last one? Do you do that?
I
Or you just sort of feel like you've got to get on to the next thing, or do you give your
Yeah, especially because The Missing Hours was like so long in working, and even as I was doing the final revisions, I was thinking about, I kind of got the idea for this book probably at least 2 years ago. And then I kind of was like, well, am I sure this is the book I want to write? Like I wanted to let it sit for a while because, it's going to be the next multiple years of my life. Um, but yeah, I started just like making notes about it, and notes about character, notes about relationships. Um, it's probably been close to 2 years that I've been thinking about it. And then and then let's see, I started like actually putting words on the page probably like 6 months ago, but I don't have very much at this point. Like it's just very dabbling. I have as much that I've cut again as that I keep.
well, we can't wait. So 18 months, right?
Well, we'll see. Yeah. Knock wood. If the schools don't go into lockdown again.
Oh, right. Oh, God.
Right, I should laugh. Okay.
I know. Thank you
Vaccines for young people. Yay.
Yay!
I know.
Thank you so much. This has been a
Thank
great
you.
conversation. It's great to get to talk to you and get your perspective on all of this and talk about your amazing book. So,
Oh, thank you for having me. This is super fun. I can't wait to see who comes next. This sounds
well,
like a super cool project. Yeah.
thank you so much, Julia.
Thanks for joining us on our very first episode of Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.